In this chapter, we will look at examples when one king is stuck in the middle. As you can see, in this case, it is the black king. That's, of course, generally a very dangerous thing for the king that's stuck in the middle, especially when you can open files and diagonals to attack it. And of course, that should be your task. When you see a king couple moves away from castling, try to do anything and everything you can to open files, diagonals, and attack the king, even if at times it may cost you a pawn or sometimes more. The first example we are seeing is a game of mine from a simultaneous exhibition that I gave in Stillwater, Oklahoma. I was playing against Glasgow, and we reached this position after just 12 moves, and my opponent went pawn hunting with the queen. As you can see, the black queen just captured a pawn on c3, attacking my rook in the corner. This is typically how one side or the other gets his or her king stuck in the middle of the board, that they go pawn hunting or they start a premature attack and neglect the basic principles of chess, namely put your king to safety as early as you can. Well, in this position it was my turn and I played rook to b1. With this move, I obviously saved my rook and at the same time am attacking the pawn on b7. Also, the pawn on d5 is hanging. If black would try to finally get to castling by developing the bishop, the problem is the pawn on g7 would be lost, and after that the king permanently would lose a safety hope of castling to the king's side, and castling to the queen's side would already not be a real improvement regarding the safety of the king, given that the b and c files are already wide open. So in this position, my opponent played rook to d8 to at least save the pawn on d5. And I captured the pawn on b7, which not only regains the sacrificed pawn, but also, more importantly, puts my rook on the 7th rank. Generally, if a rook can get there and cannot be chased out immediately, it's a huge achievement. Again, black has difficulties in developing the bishop, this time not just because of the bishop b2 g7 idea, but even a lot more powerful is to play queen a4, pinning the knight on c6, and if black castles, only then bishop b2, because now the problem is that the black queen can no longer hang on to the knight. Black will lose a piece. If in this position black would try to develop with bishop to a3, which prevents obviously the bishop b2 idea, then white has a number of good moves, among them capturing the pawn on d5, but also simply just transposing to an endgame where black pretty much loses a bunch of pawns, probably will end up being at least 2 pawns down after the 2 rooks, or rather the second rook, also comes to the 7th rank. In the actual game, my opponent played queen c4 in hopes that maybe next move, finally, the bishop from f8 can develop and black can get to castle. It's all about black trying to finally reach that safety zone and white trying to prevent it. And indeed, I played bishop to b2, pressuring that pawn on g7, making sure the bishop cannot just comfortably develop. Well, what can black do? If the rook would move to g8, on one hand that would protect the pawn on g7, but obviously moving the rook would at the same time mean that black can no longer castle, so that would be no real help. So my opponent went pawn hunting again by capturing on a2, which of course looks like a very naive move in my mind. And in this position, white has various good ways to play. Given that I was playing a simultaneous, I perhaps didn't find the very best, objectively best move that the computer considers being an immediate killer, which is queen d3. The key point here and in some other variations is that black cannot retreat with the queen to c4, because after the exchange of queens, the knight on c6 will be hanging. And therefore, the threat of rook a1 coming is an absolute killer. I played instead queen c1, which may be somewhat inferior, but still good enough to win the game, attacking the knight now on c6. And the queen went back to a6, not only protecting the knight, but at the same time attacking my rook as well. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, I want to make sure that my rook stays there. I really like being on the 7th rank. Now, the knight is hanging on c6. If the knight moves away, I would just improve my position. Generally, you want to have your pieces, especially queen and some of your other pieces, as close to your opponent's king as possible, and as many of your pieces as possible. In this case, not only we bring the queen closer to where the action is, namely the black king, but also opening the first rank for the white rook of the king side to enter the action, enter the attack. For example, after f6, rook a1, and then we can take on a7 with the rook on the first rank. Alternatively, if instead of f6, black takes on e2, then queen a4, checkmate pretty much immediately. So my opponent was, again, trying to get rid of my rook, which is certainly a good thought. However, it allows an immediate win, which unfortunately I missed, although I chose the simple way to win, but not the most precise one. The most precise one actually reminds me of the chapter that we learned in the previous volume of the video series in the Tactics, volume 6, where we learned about intermediate moves and intermediate checks. And this is one of those things, again, in a quick game, or in this case simultaneous game, one has to make a move real quick. So what can I do? My rook is being attacked. I either move it or capture the opponent's rook, or maybe protect it, and it slipped my mind that I had an even much better option, namely queen a1, a pretty unexpected move, attacking black's queen with the idea that if queen takes, then comes the intermediate move, and not just one of it, but more importantly, a second one. And that's the move that slipped my mind during the game. So after rook c8, I simply chose to took and bishop d5. Of course, it's very clear that white must be winning in a position like this, despite the material balance that we still maintain. The black king is still stuck. There is still no hope for the black bishop to develop anytime soon, because the white bishop from b2 is still eyeing at the pawn on g7, and therefore black is in a pretty hopeless situation. In fact, to save the knight, they must move the knight to e7, which protects the queen on c8. Naturally, I prefer not to trade queens when the opponent's king is in the middle of the board. Remember, when you are attacking, and usually we refer to attacking the opponent's king, the last thing you want to do is trade queens, unless it's already the time to either force a checkmate or immediate material gain. So I played queen e3, pinning the knight, and my opponent came to counterattack again with queen c2. Of course, here I could move my bishop also, would still not spoil the game, but here I found a more forceful, more concrete way to pretty much end the game. I played rook c1. My opponent took my bishop, and here comes a forced sequence of checks, one after the other. If now king b6, then just queen b7, skewer winning the queen. So my opponent went to b8, check again. Now I have discovery, so there must be many ways to win here. Although I have to be careful because my rook is hanging, so I cannot just move anywhere with my bishop, because not only my rook is hanging, but it's hanging with a check. So I have to be actually careful a bit. So I played bishop d7, which is a double check, not allowing black to capture my rook. King b7, and bringing the rook into the attack, and check, and checkmate. So as you can see, leaving the king in the middle of the board can be really, really dangerous. Let's see another game of mine that I played at a very important tournament, in the Candidates Tournament back in 1994, against one of the top women players in the world, Pia Kramling from Sweden. We reached this position after 21 moves, and you may wonder, why is that black rook on a8 highlighted? What's so interesting or important about that? Well, it's kind of funny, because during the game, at this point in the game, I actually forgot about it, what's the importance of it. But there is a very big importance to it, in the fact that that rook has moved already a couple times earlier in the game, meaning that black can no longer castle to the queen side of the board. It's always really important keeping track of the rules, and sometimes it's easy to forget that a certain piece, whether the rook or the king, moved earlier, then walked back to its initial square when it appears that you may be able to castle, but in reality, as we know, once you move the rook, the king can no longer castle to that side of the board, or if you move the king, you no longer can castle on either side of the board. So in this position, I understood that it's to my interest to keep the black king in the middle of the board, and that's why I continued with bishop e3. Gaining a momentum, a tempo, attacking black's queen. The queen moved away, and now actually I was spending about 10 minutes on the clock trying to figure out what I'm gonna do after I stop black from castling to the king side, but if she castles to the queen side. Well, I figured there's not much I can do about it. I cannot stop the king from castling to both sides at the same time, but I'll take it if the king castles to the queen side. It's still a lot more open than the king side. Then my opponent kind of woke me up in the post-mortem, in the analysis after the game, that, Susan, remember, I already moved my rook a couple times at this stage? Oh well. So anyway, she remembered it during the game. I wonder what would have happened if she tries actually to castle. Well, if I realize it, what would have happened is, that means she touches her king, and she would have to move her king instead of castling, since that's an illegal move. So after bishop c5, she played bishop to c8, trying to get rid of my knight on f5. But let's first see what would happen if she would go pawn hunting with bishop takes h2 check. I planned to move the king to h1, obviously no other choice, bishop e5, and then play rook b to d1. As we already established, it's not to stop the black king from castling to the queen side, but to put the rook on the open file and to prepare appearance on d6 of either the white knight or bishop in the near future. If black plays rook d8 to stop that, I would take, and gain control of the open file again with rook d1, queen c7, and simply just keep improving, keep putting all my pieces on optimal positions. And for example, if black plays bishop c8 in hopes again to either put it on e6 or capture maybe my knight on f5, in positions like this, when we feel that all the white pieces are in their optimal positions, we can feel that there must be something. I have news for you. Usually there is something. Actually, if you feel like, try to pause for a few moments and figure out what is that something. And the easiest and prettiest way to win is to play bishop b6, deflecting the queen. The queen cannot just move to b7 because of the checkmate on d8. And if takes, then discovery, opening up the f file, check, and checkmate. So going back to the position after bishop c5, my opponent played bishop to c8. And again, I need to improve further my position. We can see, obviously, my rooks are not yet participating in the attack, neither is my bishop on c2. So it's one of those two pieces that I'd want to improve. And that's exactly what I did. I played rook b to d1. And my opponent took on f5 in hopes that after this exchange and knight retreat, black is now only one move away from castling. If she would succeed with that, she would be quite fine. But it doesn't quite happen, or at least not without losing material. And I need to improve my other rook as well. There are two open files in the center, so the second rook belongs in that other open file. And now the moment is critical. What happens if black castles? So I need to see that before I would have played rook e1. Again, it's time for tactics. In order to convert any type of strategical advantage or dynamic temporary advantage, at some point usually you need to do a combination or some kind of sequence of forceful moves in order to convert a kind of theoretical advantage to a practical material advantage. And here that solution is opening up the diagonal of the bishop. A pawn is well worth it. Here are the tricks. If bishop takes, and a fork. Alternatively, if the pawn takes, which looks horrible already in itself, opening up the g file right in front of the king with the white light squared bishop looking there and the queen around there, the rooks ready to come out to the fourth rank. But actually there is an immediate forceful way to win the game here. By takes, check, forcing the king to the corner, make sure it doesn't run away, and queen f5, and the checkmate is unstoppable. Let's go back to the position after rook f to e1, when my opponent, I assume, saw all that, and that's why instead played rook d8. At this point, she'd be more than happy if I'm exchanging the rooks, even though she's losing the right to castle anytime after that in the game if king takes back. But maybe the king could try to escape to the queen side, which is relatively safe, at least compared to being in the middle of the board. But here it's important to calculate accurately and see how to, as I said, convert the threats to actual material advantage or checkmate. I took with my bishop on e7. If king e7, I would play queen g3 using the pin over the bishop on e5. My opponent inserted an intermediate move, exchanging, hoping that I may move my rook away from the pinning position, but of course not. My rook needs to be there. So either the queen or the king takes, the pin will remain. Now if queen takes, the pawn on c6 would get in trouble. So black took back with the king. And now it's time to take care of this pin here, queen g3. If f6, I can take on g7, so that's not an option. Black had no choice but activating the king, which is certainly not a great thing. And now the king chase starts. Queen h4. If king f5, the checkmate comes, or, well, major material win, like this. Black played g5, queen h6. If king e7, I'm using the pin and creating a double attack, winning material immediately. Of course, king f5 is not any better. Perhaps she wanted to please the spectators that day, because I got the pleasure of giving a pawn checkmate all the way up to here, and this is when she resigned.